Ever since humans have roamed the earth, they always wanted to leave their legacy behind. And that was with the help of sculptures, statues, buildings, and other things. You might be familiar with this man, Vallabhbhai Patel, the man that kept India united, and we've made a video about him. To show respect to Vallabhbhai Patel and for their own history, they decided to create the biggest statue dedicated to the Iron Man of India, so it can stay here for a very long time. Our video is about statues, but not a lot of them. It's about one of them, Mount Rushmore, in the state of South Dakota. There is a mountain range in the state of South Dakota called Black Hills, and even though it has hills in the name, it's actually a mountain range. In the year 1923, a historian by the name of Don Robinson was very interested in the state of South Dakota, and when he saw this mountain range called the Black Hill, he decided it would be cool to put a giant statue of historical figures inside the mountain. His goal was to make the state of South Dakota have more tourist attraction, and his idea was genius. South Dakota is in the middle of nowhere when you look at it on the US map, and it's in the least populated area in the US, and that is why there were never any tourists in this area, and it was not an important location whatsoever. The governor of South Dakota and the people in charge were very interested in this idea, but they asked them, who should we put up here? Robinson says, since this is native land, we should put 2 statues of native people, and we should also add Lewis and Clark next to them. Who are Lewis and Clark? In the year 1804, these 2 gentlemen were hired by Thomas Jefferson to search the land of Louisiana that they just had purchased from France. So Lewis and Clark's job was very important to figure out what is going on in Louisiana and the surrounding areas and report back to the president. Their expedition took about 4 years, and they were finally done when they got back. And that is why 120 years after this took place, Mr. Robinson, the historian, suggests to put Lewis and Clark up there in the mountain. The state really liked this idea, and up next they went to hire a sculptor to finish the job. They hired a Danish-American sculptor by the name of Gudson Berglund. He was a very well-known sculptor at that time, and he'd already made some statues for the state of Georgia. Berglund, with the help of his son named Lincoln, which was also an engineer, decided to take his men inside the mountain to see which location is best, which place has the best light and the hardest rock. Berglund and his son decide this location, and they say this part is better than anywhere else. It has very good lighting, and the entire mountain is made up of granite. Berglund sends his information to the state, and he also adds something else. He tells the state of South Dakota that we shouldn't put these men on the mountain. We should put 4 of the best presidents of the US up there. Since back then, the people in charge were much more racist, they loved the idea of changing it from Native Americans and Lewis and Clark to US presidents they admired. So they liked this guy's idea. George Washington was chosen because he was the first president and one of the most important founding fathers. Thomas Jefferson for expanding US land by a lot. Theodore Roosevelt was chosen because he represented conservation and industrial blossoming of the nation, and this was a very important thing, and that is why he was chosen to be the 3rd president. And last but not least, we have Abraham Lincoln, and obviously the most important reason is that he led the country through the Civil War, and he believed in preserving the nation at any cost, and he also ended slavery. It took 4 years for the state of South Dakota to decide which of the 4 presidents they want to put on Mount Rushmore. And in the year 1927, when everything was approved, construction finally began. Of course, Berglund has to create the first model before they start constructing. The model that was first made was 1/12 of the actual size, so it was pretty ginormous. In the model, Thomas Jefferson is on the left side of George Washington, but now you see Thomas Jefferson on the right side of George Washington. And the reason was, when they started digging the left side, they realized there was a lot of quartz in this part of the mountain. Quartz is not a bad rock, but it's not as strong as granite, and that is why the location was changed to the right side of George Washington's head. How did they start work? With dynamite. Of course, the places they wanted empty, they started exploding them, and then building around them and using jackhammers around that. 400 men go at it with jackhammers and chisels to get the first outline of the sculptures. They cut so much rock and so much rubble added on that at the end of the job, when they counted how much rubble they took out of here, it added to more than 450,000 tons. After the first part is finished, meaning they dug out everything, they exploded everything, now the hard part is gonna begin. The actual designers and sculptors have to be let down to slowly work on the design of the faces. Most importantly, the hair, nose, eyes, eyebrows, everything like that. The men that worked on this sculpture had to be fearless, because the way they were let down was with cables and ropes, and they were sitting on wooden chairs, and they had to stay there for hours on end and chisel away. The most important part is that more than 1,000 men worked on this project for more than 14 years, but not one person died. This is important for the 1930s, because this is the same era the Golden Gate is being built, and a lot of men fell down and got killed. And it was the Great Depression, so people were lining up by the Golden Gate. In case someone falls, they would have a job opening. And on the other side of the country, in New York, the same thing was happening. They were building skyscrapers and they were waiting for men to fall down from there as well. Something like this was obvious in the Great Depression, but after that it wasn't like this. In Mount Rushmore, even children used to work, because there wasn't a law for child labor yet. But their job wasn't too difficult or hard. They were just call boys. That means they were the walkie-talkie, so you would give them a message and they would pass it along all the way to the person that needed the message. You might ask, why didn't they just use the radio or walkie-talkie? Well, the radio had not been invented yet, because it was invented in 1937 and it was only made for military use. When they're in the middle of the job, another problem appeared. The Native Americans start complaining and asking, why are you touching our mountain? This mountain belongs to us. In the year 1848, the American government had signed a deal with the natives here that this is native land, which is called an Indian reservation. But now the white man takes our mountain and builds 4 statues out of it. So all they were trying to do was stop the work, because they didn't approve of this. Obviously, they had no power over the US government, so the job continued on without being stopped. The job is moving slowly but surely. But when we get to the year 1941, the sculpture actually dies and the job stops. The important part of the sculpture is finished and you could see the faces, but it's nowhere near done. The original plan was to actually have the sculptures standing up, at least have a full suit on. The main designer, Berglund, has died. The year is 1941 and the US is about to join the war, and the entire continent of Europe is already at war. And of course, the natives are complaining about this mountain, so they had no choice but to stop the work. The same thing you see today was done in 1941 because they didn't touch it anymore. This sculpture stays here until we get to the year 1980. This is when the US Supreme Court says it was the US government's fault for building Mount Rushmore without the natives' permission, and that is why they have to pay them a fine. The number they came up with was $1 billion to the natives in this area that the US government has to pay all. But the interesting part is, the natives over here did not take the money. They said, "We don't want the money, we want our land back." This shows us that the natives that live here and lived here were very proud of their culture, and it was a sacred place for them. So obviously they want their land back rather than some money. The mountain that Mount Rushmore has been made on is one of the strongest granites ever. Experts believe that these statues will stay here for hundreds of thousands of years, and it has an erosion rate of 1 inch per 10,000 years. So in 10,000 years, it will probably look the same, which is insane. The white people designed the sculpture and made it, and of course the natives were not happy about it. But this has caused more than 3 million people to visit Mount Rushmore as a tourist attraction. And if these statues weren't here, nobody would visit the state.